All right, so just a quick round of applause to our panelists. So one of the things that really stood out to me is that the issue of safety and efficacy around MCMs is just one piece of the puzzle, right? So we heard about how from all these different perspectives, when you are aware of a threat and you know you have to do something, there are a lot of things that are going on in your minds. And the safety and efficacy piece, monitoring and assessment is just one piece of that. So we also heard that there's sort of this process, and I'm probably going to oversimplify this, but you learn about the threat and you learn about the risk profiles of different populations that might be threatened by this threat. Then you figure out what the solutions are and the availability of the stuff, as Boris was saying earlier today, and then you come up with a plan for distribution. And then after that, it's sort of out of your hands. So we don't know, are people actually going to follow the plan for distribution? When the MCMs are given to the population, are they going to follow through with what you've recommended they do with this? So I have a couple of questions I'm going to open up to the panel, but to the audience as well. One of the things that I think Adam noted was we first have to define the key questions that we want to answer, right? And I'm not sure that we're there yet with this. It wasn't clear to me necessarily what some of the nitty-gritty key questions were for the different audiences with regard to safety and efficacy. So first, for the state and local folks, so the state and local health departments or emergency managers, what are the key questions that you have in relation to efficacy and safety of MCMs? In other words, if you were going to go to the CDC or FDA and ask some questions about the efficacy and safety of the MCMs that you're supposed to be distributing, what would you want to know?
I would like to take it in a slightly different direction, and that's about the methods through which local health departments receive these sort of data and identifiers during an emergency. In past responses, including Zika and Ebola, information that we know about the threat and the countermeasures and the impacted population comes through surveillance systems to the CDC, to the awardees, and then down to the local level. And at each level, we lose nuances and we lose the ability to directly question the people who performed the research and the data collection. And I feel like that handicaps us locally in being able to act in the optimum way for the situation that we're facing.
So your key question might be, by the time you're getting the information, is it so watered down that you've lost some of the nuance that you need to make decisions?
Yeah, and to advocate for more direct access to the source at the local level.
Okay. Any other local or state folks in the room? What key questions do you have?
Take a stab at it. One of the, I guess, issues we deal with in every emergency is, guidance changes. And it changes seemingly by the hour at times.
Why are you looking this way?
Looking at you guys. So, that really impacts at the state and local level how we actually, implement those plans and operations. So, I don't know if it's necessarily a question, but, having a better process to put out updates and really informing the impacted population and the clinicians that have to implement it effectively. We're always having to say, no, that was the old guidance. You need to focus on this, especially with Ebola, with the PPE as it changed. People were pulling their hair out as far as how they needed to protect their healthcare workers. I don't know, we don't necessarily have a solution to that. Every event's going to unravel as it goes, but just taking that into consideration that we have to try to not maybe limit the amount of changes that we do in impacting the clinical community, because they will get very frustrated and lose the sight of where they need to act.
Well, on the flip side, so as the emergency evolves and more data comes in, they need to change the guidance if needed, right? So
There's a balance.
that's a balance, yeah. So I don't think we can say that guidance should not change. It should change when it is appropriate.
Right.
And when it changes, as you said, the information should come down right away to you.
Yeah.
And we are applying the data that you provide us at the local level in ways you never imagined. The environmental health and safety recommendations that came out during Ebola, we attributed to try to understand and mitigate the risks faced to sewage workers that were processing waste coming out of hospitals. And so we may be taking leaps sometimes with what you have shared, and we should understand the limitations.
Very interesting. I have a question building on the communication piece and the flow of information from somewhere out to the public health and to the clinicians. Are there mechanisms or methods by which you receive information from the clinical community about the response or about what they're using for the response that might be able to trickle back up to us to help us, A, with clearer communication, understand what the questions are, but B, how to best communicate changes when they need to happen and have some of those changes informed by what's going on the ground?
So as far as how we gather information from providers and healthcare facilities, we have a variety of tools. I'm not going to go into all the details, but we have systems for communication to allow them to give us situational awareness, what's going on. We have direct access through a variety of different associations. We have something called our Health JIC, or Health Joint Information Center, where we'll bring in different health partners and those association partners so they can push information out and gather it back as part of our EOC. So those are a couple different ways, both through personal relationships and then through some of those IT systems. And we try to take the information that we're getting and internalize that and put out webinars, conference calls, those kind of things, and definitely share the guidance that's coming from our federal partners. We always try to stay in step with that. It just at times it can be challenging.
So,
I just wanted to comment as one case example would be during Paramivir, because that was based on recommendation for the being use of Paramivir was based on available scientific information at the time. And when it went out to the clinicians, and it was direct to hospitals, as you would recall, while state and local partners were informed, the questions came directly from clinicians, healthcare providers, pharmacists on dose modifications, such as renal dosing and loading doses. So I think definitely, I think the clinicians, your point of clinicians, as they incorporate practice on recommendations and the product usage, it does have feedback, including directly to federal entities for asking for information to guide, I guess, optimal or appropriate use of it. And one example, when you asked that question, was about the dosing recommendation that was changed based on the request from the clinicians.
okay, we
In our
have,
state, less than 2/3 of physicians subscribe to our epi-info alerts, and many who do, it's just a fax going to an emergency department. And so I get anxious about the ability to relay those clinical guidelines to those on the front lines.
so I have two questions at the mic here, but I'm going to tee up a question for the FDA folks before we hear from them. And my question to you is, what information do you need to make the regulatory decisions that you have to make? So what information do you need from the field to make decisions? Or what are your key questions that you're trying to answer? So first we'll go here and then here.
Hello, my name is Rob Lawrence. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Richmond Ambulance Authority in Richmond, Virginia. I'm also here representing the National Association of EMTs, and as you can tell, I'm also the British judge in the EMT reality show that we live every single day. A couple of comments to my point. First of all, my communication centre director went to Disney World and broke her leg. first of all. Conversely, Richmond sits at the midway point, the exact centre of I-95 between Maine and Florida. And most of our evening crashes at night are from people from Maine going south and people from Florida going north. And so we're collecting that data as well, which is fascinating. To my point, I was delighted to hear Alison Levy talk about EMS. And being from NAMT, I'm going to add to that point that currently, in terms of public health emergencies, we sit at the epicenter of one of the largest public health emergencies we've seen in a long time. That is opioids. Currently, our ability to conduct biosurveillance, syndromic surveillance, to be able to identify not necessarily the point of sale, but the point of consumption, gives us a lot of intelligence, gives us a lot of data, and enables us to assist the very, very many opioid task forces that are coming up now. And so EMS has that huge amount of data. We also work very closely with our own public health departments around the country, and King County is actually the poster child of EMS working very closely with public health, and I commend you for that. But the fact is that from a syndromic perspective, we're seeing it first. We're seeing those things happen first, and EMS across the country and indeed across the modern world has that ability to almost be the sort of combat indicator point, or the point of combat indication, if you like, that something's coming and something's coming quickly. And so I just make that point and commend what Alison said earlier.
Thank you.
Perrin Cobb, Los Angeles. So this has been a terrific panel, and I really appreciate the contributions of each of the panelists. It's been very interesting. I'd like to challenge the group, if I may, to help us understand from your perspective, if we use the approach to crawl, walk, run, let's say let's skip the crawling phase, the next step, and get to the walking phase. What disruptive change, not necessarily technology, because it sounds like, and listening to you all and also talking to some folks in the audience, that the technology's out there, maybe there just needs to be applied. But what disruptive change would allow you to be able to do your job much better than you are, but bring a much greater likelihood of public health and the threat of an emergency, and how can we help foster or facilitate that change?
Let's hear one or two responses, and then we'll go to the next question. So,
really quick, better modeling data before the disaster, from everything about throughput to where people are going to want to access care. We base our plans on a whole lot of assumptions.
How could that happen? What would need to change for that to happen, for you to get what you need to do your job optimally and provide help?
We need local partnerships with academic research centers to test and validate assumptions.
So I think that's a deliverable we can embrace. And then one more person, I guess. I'll talk to people at the break.
I have two comments, and one is really on this data modeling. It's that the right shareholders, the right stakeholders are at the table when that data modeling is done. So post-Ebola, post-PPE, there was never a lot of evaluation of all the people that were out there in the ERs trying to do this. Maybe that stayed local, but it didn't roll up anywhere. Nobody came out and said, so if you're going to do the modeling, the right people need to be at the table. And the other thing I would say, I would argue a little with you. I think the technology is there, but the technology is not there in terms of the health IT systems. It's not embedded in there. They're not designed to do these kind of things.
We agree. I didn't mean that it doesn't exist. It just hasn't been set up so that it could be applied.
Your point, it's the integration component. So we've got this response structure that we've been working on for 15 years and that we've exercised continuously. Every time we have a new threat, it gets exercised again, we learn something else. This integration of all that big data, small data, and how it integrates with distribution, dispensing, and even upstream from development into regulatory decisions, I don't think it's integrated as well as it could be.
Connectedness point that Boris was making. Thank you very much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So I'll just add to that. I think the disruptive change would be the use of information as close to the point as close to the real indicator as possible. I actually reviewed the paper that kind of led to Google Flu. It was a physician in Canada who paid for an advertisement and kind of tracked the use of that and was able to show how, look, the use of people querying for this information actually showed the flu indicators. There were two important things that showed. You know, if we look at the whole process, Google Flu and how they did that. Number one is that there were indicators of change at the very tight point of care actually can be really useful. Number two, we actually have to keep looking for those because measures have a lifespan. And the challenge with Google Flu is that after a few years, they overcorrected or they overpredicted, not because the flu changed, but because the measure changed, because the data that they were bringing in changed over those years and they didn't adjust for it. So we can use data in identifying change at the point, but we have to also recognize that what about that data is changing that may make it less useful.
So I'm hoping, Carmen, that you're going to answer the question I had about what regulatory decisions or the FDA needs to make. Thank you.
The way that you're hoping, but I do want to stimulate a little dialogue around that. So, you know, the type of data that FDA needs for regulatory decision making is only one of the types of data that we're talking about. And normally, even for public health emergency medical countermeasures, those deliberations occur in the context of the regulatory review with the product sponsors as the product is being developed or as the product is being approved. Products that are already approved, there are post-marketing commitments or requirements that kind of identify what is the minimum level of information we want to know about that product once it's being used in the public health emergency. But I want to echo Anita's point that, and we have this conundrum, and I'm glad we're talking about it, it's almost a chicken and an egg. Every time we get to talking about this, we get into this circular argument. Tell me how I can access all the data in the world. Well, I can't tell you unless you tell me what data you need. Tell me how to access, tell me the data, tell me what you need. I can't tell you what you need unless you tell me. And we can't seem to get past that because the truth of the matter is that for public health emergencies, we may have an idea, as Anita had listed, of some of the types of questions that we want to ask, but we probably can't get more granular than that. The piece I think that we're missing, or that I feel is missing, is that conversation about all of these different opportunities where data might be. And how can we assess whether or not we can use those data and use them in a way that's not disrupting dispensing, distribution, concepts of operations, clinical care. We're not adding to a physician and telling him, add this to your electronic health record, because what we're trying to get is the information that would go in there anyway. And so I think it's a very interesting and complex conundrum. It's beyond what does the FDA need, although that's part of the equation. I think it's how do we leverage where the data is to pull those data in to answer all of these different types of questions. The example that was said just earlier about EMS being your sentinel, ooh, something very bad is happening. Well, I would flip that to the countermeasure world. They may be the first ones that are seeing that a countermeasure is not performing the way we thought it was, and oh boy, we're not mitigating this public health emergency the way we thought. We're actually hurting more people. We have experience with countermeasures that have gone out the door, and then as we survey, we realize, oh my God, this vaccine is causing Guillain-Barré syndrome. This is even worse than giving the vaccine. Those are the types of things that we want to look at. How can we utilize and leverage the systems that are already in place, the systems that are up and coming, connecting things that are disconnected right now to answer all those questions. Yeah. And part of the dialogue is that. What type of data do we need? How might we need to prioritize it? What are the systems? How could we use those to get to those answers?
Thank you.
Can I just build on Colin's point real quick?
I do think you pointed out you made an interesting point that what's happening in the room right now seems to be what's been happening for the past few years. It's a circular thing. Well, what data do you need? I don't know. What data do you have? So I think that's a really good point. Even a simple question that we've tried to ask, what are the key decisions that need to be made? No one seems to be able to answer, although you just pointed one out. You want to know that you're not doing more harm, right? So that's a really important question. We all probably want to know that we're not doing more harm. So then the next step would be, okay, how would we know that we're doing harm, and what would be the signals of that? Where could we find the signals? So I want to challenge all of you to think about even just simple questions like that. How can we not do harm? Is this MCM working the way it was intended? How can we focus in on those very simple key questions?
And one step further, how can we rapidly use those signals to design the targeted studies that we need to conduct in the emergency to answer more in depth those questions?
Yeah. Okay. So Anita, and then we'll go back here.
Really quick, just wanted to also highlight, as we're thinking about this for the next couple of days, there's a scalability to the data needs that I don't know if we've mentioned yet. So there's definitely baseline data that's always going to be needed, but depending on the threat, depending on the emergency, depending on the severity, depending on how willing we are from a risk-benefit standpoint, there may be more requests for information, so that scalability needs to be considered too.
Absolutely.
Charles Cairns, University of Arizona. I just wanted to follow up on the Rear Admiral's point about integrating existing data sources. So I've just been in this situation where I've been involved with developing a system that actually takes EMS data, 911 data, emergency department data, does not only syndromic surveillance, but actually establishes baseline and develop fairly sophisticated analytic tools that allow us to detect differences, in some cases 2 to 3 cases differences in, say, a geography defined by a county, and do that statewide across multiple states. It's called the National Collaborative for Biopreparedness. It's been funded by DHS. And if you look it up, you'll see it has that capability now. I think one of the key things about detecting it, though, is having the information in time to have an effective intervention or an effective impact on the event. And I really liked Dr. Cullen's comments that it needed to be timely, it needed to be at the point of care, and it needed to be able to engage the populations that are being affected. And so having systems that can scale up will be critical to that. I can tell you that in terms of early detection, I think that having an emergency setting is probably a good one, because that's where you're going to see at least those with severe, serious, and certainly critical illness that require hospital resources. But I think that we have an ability to do this. We have systems in our hospital, and again, Banner Health System, where we are all the time monitoring critical conditions. It's running in the background. It's looking at patient characteristics of their vital signs. And when there's a change in their vital signs and there are certain medicines that are triggered, there's actually an emergency alert that goes out, and it has an emergency response team across 30 hospitals, including critical access hospitals. This is running 24/7 in the background automatically. And then the last piece is, if we want to get to systems outside of a hospital, there are monitoring systems now. We have diabetics that are literally having every one of their glucose monitors at their home are updated, as are their weights, their blood pressures. These are continuously fed back, not on the medical record, but also to their physicians. And then finally, one of the things that puts all this together, if you take a look at the NCBP system, it's symptom-based. So you might not even you don't have to know what you're looking for. You can just look for variants in the symptoms, or if you do know what you're looking for, you can plug that in and get it. Imagine then you use this internal system in the hospital to detect patients with that. And we actually have a system we're using now for clinical trials that crosses both Epic and Cerner and can identify, for example, all 50-year-old males with creatinines of 2.0 whose blood pressure is over 140, and whose white blood cell counts are greater than 16. Those are automatic systems that are happening across 30 hospitals now continuously. I think that we can do this. I think that we need to put these kinds of systems in place towards this problem. And then one thing about having good clinical trials is once we identify those problems, is there a whole bunch of adaptive trial techniques that will get us an answer very quickly. Not only what's happening with those patients, which patients would benefit, but frankly detecting those safety and challenging signals. I really think we need to move beyond discussions, but these systems are out there working right now, day to day, across literally millions of people.
Yes, and then we have another question here.
First off, that was great, but so I want to go back to my design thing, and that technology can do this, but it's not doing that, because what you're describing is not, it's far beyond just citizen scientists, it's healthcare team scientists. We have a huge potential, amazing group of people that can help us solve all this that are already trained. But they can't use their health IT system to query my patients with a creatinine numbered in 2, blah, 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 blah. Now, in your system, I know you're saying they can, but by and large, the systems that are out there, we haven't empowered people to understand that, you know what, you really are the early sentinel awareness, and you are the person that's going to know if the MCM is causing a problem right now.
So, good point. And again, you know, Banner's a large system, fourth largest nonprofit healthcare system in the country, so it's large. 30 hospitals, 7 states. But it's not everyone. And I think that we need to think about how we apply these technologies to existing systems. My colleague here, Dr. Bartz, is at Duke, and she's already developing a system that's going to be open access. And I don't know if she wants to comment on the potential for this, but this is the kind of solution I think we can move towards. But we need to kind of utilize some of these systems, apply them to this problem, and think about how we detect, treat, study, outcomes, and of course, the end is there are what, 3 billion Google searches a day in the world? There are 2 billion people on Facebook? I think we can disseminate these results pretty quickly. We just need to link to it.
And a question or comment over here?
Yes, I'm Ben Eloff, Deputy Director of Epidemiology in the Center for Devices and Radiological Health at FDA. I actually wanted to provide a little bit more granular of an answer. I can tell you one thing definitely that is needed, at least from the device point of view, that would make our regulatory decision-making easier. And that is more granular, better identification of the medical product and the exposure to that medical product. In the biologic and drug worlds, it's fairly easy to identify, and systems exist for, National Drug Code, and can identify when a vaccine is given. But medical devices covering the gamut from tongue depressors and stethoscopes through, implanted cardioverter defibrillators, it gets a little bit more difficult to understand what role a given device is playing in the identification or response to an emergency. And having that information, the gentleman just spoke previously, talked about various glucose meters being continuous. What if one of the manufacturers has a misline in their algorithm that's providing erroneous results, whereas other meters aren't? That's something that we can only detect if we know which devices are providing those results. And this goes, even further into other things.
Thank you. And then one final comment here, and we need to break for lunch. Sorry.
Points about data collection resonate in many different areas and fields. It's not unique to our situation here. However, one issue that is very, very clear is that, and I'm going to describe it as a food chain of data, that just because you can collect data doesn't mean you should collect the data. I think that's something that we forget sometimes, and data is not information. Data is potential for information. But if you look at the food chain of data generation, we often collect it too late in the chain because we can, and it's easy to do that. If we move further back in the chain, it's harder to find the data, but the data is often more valuable. How can that be achieved in this setting? And the other point is that so much of the data we're collecting isn't always matching well to what we need, simply because the events we're trying to prepare for haven't occurred yet. These are rare events. That becomes the challenge. So any comments on those points would be certainly welcome.
Anyone have 10 to 15 seconds of comments they want to share?
So the one statement I'll make in this, and trying not to keep you from eating, the challenge in healthcare is sometimes the most useful data that's at the point of care is collected by the highest paid people. And that's a big challenge. And other fields, I don't know that have that level of challenge, and we need to be thinking creatively about how to navigate that.
Great. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of what to expect over the rest of today and tomorrow. So the goal of this morning was to really do a level set, as someone mentioned before, and set the stage for the conversations that are to come. This conversation, and they're passing out yellow pieces of paper. I'm going to I'll ask you a question and you can write something on it in a few minutes. But the real point of this conversation was to help us think about what information we need and what questions we're trying to answer when we're thinking about MCM efficacy and safety. So this beyond the last mile, what do we need to know about the safety and efficacy of MCMs through monitoring and assessment in order to do our jobs better. So I'm going to challenge you to, on your cards, write your name and affiliation, but then also really take it simple. What's the information that you need to do your job better, and what questions do you need answered to do your job better when you're thinking about MCM safety and efficacy? So if the first step is defining the need, the question, the second step is to think about, that we're going to think about after the lunch break, is we're going to think about existing data sets and challenges with those sources. So if we know what questions we're trying to answer, what data exists out there to help us answer those questions? And then later in the afternoon, we're going to think about the systems of operation or concept of operations and clinical trial networks and other existing infrastructure out there that can give us access to the data that we need. And then tomorrow, we will have another session and move into some action planning sessions where we'll come together and try to come up with things we can do over the next year to solve some of the problems that we've identified. So this is a linear process. We're going to try to take the steps one by one. It's obvious from today's conversation that there's a lot that needs to happen, and there's a lot of rich discussion that needs to occur, but we're going to try to sort of take it step by step. So on your yellow cards, what is the information that you need? And did you get yellow cards? Are there any extras that the panelists can have? Thanks. On the yellow cards, what information do you need, or what questions do you have related to MCM efficacy and safety? So write your name, affiliation, your thoughts, and then as you exit, you can post them on the blue wall that's to the right of the door. We will break for an hour for lunch, so I'll ask you to come back around 1:30. There are places to eat lunch around the area, and if you are a speaker or on the planning committee and you're on travel status, you should head to room 125. So, actually, wait. How long is the lunch break? I'm missing a page. It's an hour? Okay, 1:30. Come back. And with that, I will release